Hi everyone, it's Amy here from the blog I Think Therefore I Teach. Welcome to your next Nature of God instalment. This is part 2 and I'm going to specifically go over the omnipotence of God. So, here we go. The next attribute then, please check out part 1 of this where I go over the attribute of eternal. This is now the attribute of omnipotence. Remember, when you see the word potence, think of P, think of powerful. This is about the power of God. Is God all powerful? You need to know about complete versus self-imposed limitations. This has not been asked specifically in the exam before, so it could be a real option for you in this year's exam. First thing I get my students to do, just to get them engaging with the idea of power, is I get them to write down their answer as to whether God can do these, yes or no, and then we have a discussion. So can God make 2 + 2 = 5, turn a triangle into a circle, bring someone back from the dead, climb a tree, change the past, sin and understand evil? Now your answer to these will really help formulate which argument you fall into as far as Descartes, Swinburne, etc., where we are going now. So it's good if you do your answers for these, so just pause the video and do your yes or no. You don't need to explain it or anything like that, just yes or no very quickly for those questions, and it will help you formulate your line of argument for the following points, perspectives that we're going to go over. So the first argument, this concerns God's ability to do anything, even the logically impossible. So knowing the first argument, that God can do absolutely anything, even the logically impossible, this is Descartes' argument. So I get my students then to remember Descartes' ontological argument and what he talks about and how he argues it. And whilst you do not need to know the ontological argument for the 2022 exam, having it synoptically, having a synoptic understanding is very good. So I advise you to go back over his triangle argument, how he talks about it analytically, and how he talks about kind of the predicate of God, that God cannot lack. So I would go over those areas so that you can potentially link them in for those higher marks. What type of thinker was Descartes before he was known as a philosopher? And from this, which examples from the previous slide do you think he focused on? So the answer to number 2, of course, is a mathematician. Descartes was a mathematician, so therefore he focused on things like the triangle into a circle and the 2 + 2 = 5. What Descartes argued was this. He said, with this in mind, God cannot be limited in any way. Therefore, as God is the source of logic, he has the power to suspend logic and replace it with whatever he wants. Descartes goes very much down the line of, it's God. God can do anything. Anything, everything. God can suspend logic. God can replace it. God can change it. So the logic is 2 + 2 = 5. He can make it into that. He can change a triangle into a circle. He can do absolutely anything because it's God. Saying God conforms to any laws of nature, laws of gravity, things like that. Logic and physics restricts God. A bit like humans, we're restricted by those. God is separate from them. And since God made them, he can break them. Not understanding God can know everything. So not understanding how God can know everything and gain knowledge, for example, is a limit of our human logic, not God. So he's prepared, therefore, the argument or the response of, well, how is it possible to make a circle into a triangle? How is it possible to make 2 + 2 = 5? That's not logical. 2 + 2 = 4. What Descartes is saying there is, just because you can't work it out, you're just human. You didn't create these, God did. God can do anything in his omnipotence, including changing logics, physics, laws of nature. Evaluation then of Descartes. J.L. Mackie comes in and argues that the idea of logical impossible actions were only a form of words which fails to describe any state of affairs. There is nothing which is logically impossible. Logical possibilities do not exist. Now, this is a really good argument. I certainly think it's a good argument from J.L. Mackie. What he is arguing there is the semantics of words, as in, logically means you can do it. Impossible means you can't. It's an oxymoron. You cannot have something that's logically impossible. It's either impossible, which means not possible ever, or it's logically possible, for God. You cannot have something that's logically impossible, because then it's not logical if it's impossible. And so he's just basically saying that this is just a form of words. It's a form of words that doesn't make any sense. Separate criticism here, not from J.L. Mackie. It's not a lack of power or a lack of our knowledge. It's making a circle into a square is just nonsense. It's not that we don't understand it because we're limited in our logic. No, it just makes no sense. Also turns God into an arbitrary and unpredictable God, arbitrary, random, an unpredictable God who can do anything. Makes it very difficult to understand God and thus have a relationship with him, in that if God can suspend the laws of nature, and if God can turn a circle into a triangle, it makes God very hard to relate to, very unpredictable. How do we then know that 2 plus 2 used to maybe equals 5? God woke up one day and thought, oh, I think I'm going to turn it to 4 now. It makes our life very unpredictable. So if God can do absolutely anything, such as prevent evil and allow us to have free will, why doesn't he? So Descartes, going by Descartes' route, God can do absolutely anything, including the logically impossible, if those words made sense together. But if he can, let's give him that understanding, if he can do anything, then why can't we have free will and evil not exist? Why can we not have free will and still have free choice, but evil is not something we suffer? So again, that's just an example. You could do loads of other things that question God's behaviour. You could even do a synoptic link there to the inconsistent triad if you wanted to. The idea that if God is all powerful and all loving, then he should be able to stop these things. The next argument is omnipotence concerns God's ability to do what is logically possible for a perfect God. So in this, we're adding in this idea that it's a perfect God's ability to do what is logically possible. Aquinas jumps in here. He says God has the power to do whatever it is logically possible for God to do. Whatever involves a contradiction is not held by omnipotence, for it just cannot possibly make sense of being possible. Now you're probably looking at that and thinking, huh? What does that mean? It's actually brilliant. I really like this argument. I think this is a really clever argument. What Aquinas is saying there is that anything that contradicts God's perfect nature, God does not have to be able to do, because it would contradict his nature as a perfect being. It's just not possible of being possible. It doesn't make sense. God cannot do anything that contradicts his all perfect nature. So even he doesn't need, it's not a lack of power. It's just not held by his omnipotence at all. It's nothing to do with his power. It's the fact that it would contradict his perfect nature, and therefore it's not a lack of power. God just doesn't need to be able to do it. God can't do it. Basically, God cannot sin, as this contradicts God's all good nature. God cannot climb a tree, as this contradicts God being incorporeal, the idea of not having a body. So it's not a lack of power that God can't climb a tree. It just contradicts the nature of God as perfect to be able to do that. So it's not a limitation, it's a contradiction. Swinburne jumps in here and actually supports Aquinas and says he agrees that God's omnipotence means God can do everything, but we must first understand what everything includes. Turning a square into a circle is not a thing. So therefore, God does not need to be able to do it because that thing doesn't exist. Again, I really like that argument. I think it's a really clever argument. Basically, God can do everything, but what is everything? You know, and then again, you could bring Descartes back in and say, well, just because we don't understand doesn't mean it's not possible. And that again gets you good discussion there. But what Swinburne is saying is God can only do everything that is possible. And if it's not a thing, 2 plus 2 equals 5 is not a thing. A circle into a triangle is not a thing. Therefore, God does not need to be able to do it. Final view then is self-imposed limitation. This is Peter Vardy and John Macquarie. Peter Vardy says that God's omnipotence is actually limited. God is not in control of the whole of history or able to move pieces like in a chess game, chessboard. God created the universe in such a way that his ability to act is limited. The universe is created to suit free, rational creatures, us. Therefore, God limits his power over this. This is self-imposed limitation. God imposes limitations upon himself so that we can have full free will. If God was always intervening, or God could always intervene in his power, that then limits our free will. Free will, it's always been clear, right from the Bible. Everything about Christianity is about autonomy and free will. And so what Peter Vardy is here is saying is, yes, God created everything, but he limited his own control over it. God is still all-powerful because only God can limit his own power. Nice touch there, Peter Vardy. John Macquarie, similarly, Macquarie argues that God is not constrained by logic, laws of nature and physics. Well, of course he's not, because he made them, nor the acts of free-acting humans. We can't constrain God because we're only human and God's God. God merely chooses to limit his power out of love for humanity. So again, this idea that because God loves us so much, God does not want to control or impact by using his omnipotence to intervene all the time. So God chooses to limit his power because of love for us. When speaking of God's power, we do so as an analogy. I recommend that you check out analogy in religious language because you can make some excellent synoptic links, even though you do not have to do analogy anymore for the exam. God's power is very different from our own, so we are comparing similar things, our power to God's power. But these can never be the same because God is infinitely greater than us. So what he's reminding us is that we do compare our understanding of power to God because we have to compare similar things. We understand everything because of, hence why again with the previous part 1, we understand time as temporal. We have to remember that God's separate from this. So whilst we can understand God's power looking at our own, we've got to remember that God is infinitely greater than the power that we have, and therefore he can create as he has, he can give free will as he has, but then he can also limit his own power. And so at this point, I got my students just to work out whose perspective they are. Descartes' Aquinas or self-imposed limitation. So do you think Descartes' ideas of God, that God can do everything, works? Or is Aquinas' view that God can do everything as long as it doesn't contradict his perfect nature more convincing? Or do you think God limits his power to allow free will? So at this point now, I'm going to stop this video and I will do part 3 at some point with omniscience, but this will keep you going for now. So decide where you are. What team are you on? Whose argument is more convincing? Drop it below in the comments if you wish to. Otherwise, ask any questions you would like about omnipotence below and I will try and respond. Give me a thumbs up if you found this useful and don't forget to subscribe as I will be doing videos quite regularly. Otherwise, bye for now everyone.